Hey everyone, welcome to Hoboken Free Church Devotional for today, Wednesday, August 12th. So thanks for joining us. Hope everything is well as we keep going into almost mid-August now. Today we're going to be reading from Paul's letter to the Galatians, and specifically it'll be chapter 6, verses 1 to 10, really referring to how we're supposed to bear one another's burdens, talking a bit also about reaping what we sow from our actions. So I'll read through that here in a moment, and then we can talk through the verses themselves a little bit. So here's today's passage. Galatians 6, 1 to 10. Brothers, if anyone is caught in transgression, you who are spiritual should restore him in a spirit of gentleness. Keep watch on yourself, lest you too be tempted. Bear one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. For if anyone thinks he is something when he is nothing, he deceives himself. But let each one test his own work, and then his reason to boast will be in himself alone and not in his neighbor. For each will have to bear his own load. One who is taught the word must share all good things with the one who teaches. Do not be deceived. God is not mocked. For whatever one sows, that he will also reap. For the one who sows to his own flesh will from the flesh reap corruption, but the one who sows to the Spirit will from the Spirit reap eternal life. And let us not grow weary of doing good, for in due season we will reap, if we do not give up. So then, as we have opportunity, let us do good to everyone, and especially those who are of the household of faith. So there are a few different parts of this passage here, but Paul is really trying to get across the point that as believers, we've got to be able to help one another, bearing one another's burdens. And in doing so, we must ensure that we're also acting with a humble heart that's acting in service to God rather than for our own gain. And if we do these things, then we'll be able to continue in right standing with God. So in verse 1, Paul really first talks about the restoration of a believer in a gentle way. He's saying that if someone strays or someone's caught in a sin, the idea is that other believers are meant to help restore him or her. And this isn't talking about someone who has turned their back on the church or is trying to continually ignore God or be unrepentant for their sin, but really rather for someone who may have made a mistake, may seem to be more trapped in a sin. So he's not saying that there are no consequences for their actions, but the intention is that the other believers are to help this believer return to right standing with God and with the church as a whole. But he's also adding a warning for those that are assisting, that they should avoid having a sense of temptation, either for the sin that this person is being caught in that they're trying to help out with, or also for even a sense of pride or accomplishment in their work or in their help. So they shouldn't become prideful and looking down upon the person that they're helping as a result. Paul then talks about bearing one another's burdens a little more in verses 2 to 5. And so again he says, bear one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. For if anyone thinks he is something when he is nothing, he deceives himself. But let each one test his own work, and then his reason to boast will be in himself alone and not in his neighbor. For each will have to bear his own load. And the point here is that, again, we're to help one another in this process, not to be self-centered, not becoming prideful in our own abilities. So Paul warns again about becoming prideful in how we're helping others or looking down on others in that way. And really that has two parts to it. So the first is that if we're too prideful, we won't be willing to accept the assistance or the help that we may need to get out of a sin, as he had talked about in verse 1. And then the second part is that may make us actually too confident in our own abilities and lose sight of the right path that God has laid out for us in our spiritual lives. And here Paul also talks about testing our own work. And really what this means is testing our own actions against what God has prescribed through his word to make sure that we're following as we ought to and with the right attitude or the right spirit. And then verse 5 finally reminds us that ultimately we're going to have to stand before God to give account for our actions one day. And so as it is important to help others in lifting or carrying their burden, it's also important for us to make sure that we're doing things with the right intentions and the right spirit. So we're to help others here while being mindful that our own actions are done with the right intentions. And actually in the second part, that's really the second half of this in verses 6 to 10, Paul also reiterates this point, and again saying in verse 6, one who is taught the word must share all good things with the one who teaches. Do not be deceived. God is not mocked. For whatever one sows, that he will also reap. For the one who sows to his flesh will from the flesh reap corruption, but the one who sows to the Spirit will from the Spirit reap eternal life. And let us not grow weary of doing good, for in due season we will reap, if we do not give up. So then as we have opportunity, let us do good to everyone, and especially to those who are of the household of faith. So Paul is pretty clear here in saying that God will not be mocked. And what he means is that God knows the intentions of a person and their true nature, be it to giving and selfless or selfish and trying to be for their own gain. And he's pointing out that if we continue to support the ways of our flesh, we are going to continue to reap corruption and problems. But if we sow to the Spirit and work towards righteousness, we'll be able to reap eternal life as a result. So I think that's a pretty basic concept that we get out of something what we put in. But Paul is saying this principle should be applied to how we manage our resources and our actions and our time, both on earth and with regards to the spiritual realm as well. So we shouldn't and we cannot expect to gain something for nothing. Basically, there's not going to be a large reward or a gain for minimal effort or minimal input. The real key for me here is that God knows how much effort we put into our relationship with Him and with other believers. And that's not something that we can trick Him or mock Him in some way. Now, in verse 9, Paul then reminds us that as we're going about doing this good and trying to help out others, we shouldn't lose heart even if we don't yet see any results, but that we should instead remain to be persistent. And finally then, in verse 10, Paul says, "So then as we have opportunity, let us do good to everyone, and especially those who are of the household of faith." So I think that's a pretty clear way to summarize this passage, saying that we really need to make sure that we're helping out those and doing good to all, but especially those who are of the household of faith, those who are believers. So with that, I think that's really a great challenge for the week and a great way to end this devotional. Thanks so much for listening, and God bless you. We hope to see you Sunday. Thanks.